Hello, in this video, I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about Deleuze and Guattari on the workers' strike resolution. This has been a really interesting set of videos to upload because I definitely think that it allows a really in-depth explanation of like all of the different ways in which the kind of like resolution is positioning various forms of resistance that are outside of the spectrum of just like what would be considered a workers' strike. But I also think it's really interesting to consider the ways in which this type of criticism becomes particularly powerful because of the questions that this resolution asks, and therefore I think it's definitely something that I would have on my prep list, or something that I would definitely think about looking into as a literature base if I was a critical team trying to find a creative way to really engage this resolution, because I definitely think that this strategy checks all those boxes and could be something that you see at some point when teams are really looking into like more like niche specific ways of thinking about the terms of the resolution. In the last video, I think that you should definitely check it out. We talked a little bit about just like what are some of kind of like the best ways to frame what Deleuze and Guattari's critique of the resolution is and how it looks on the affirmative, and what that does in order to change like the types of like methods that make a lot of sense. And I definitely think that being able to tune into that and look at some of the conversations that we had about like the things that you'll see on case, the thing that you'll see in framework and T debates, and how to really use the kind of critique of the resolution offensively. I think that you'll find a lot of stuff that is really useful for the stuff that I'll be talking about in this video, because it's definitely a continuation from the kind of like setup that we were using to talk about like what these types of arguments could look like on the resolution. And so now I kind of really want to just start off talking a little bit about like what the responses to criticisms is like from the lens of Deleuze and Guattari. I personally think that the critical area of ground is going to be a place where Deleuze and Guattari teams really struggle the most in the affirmative, and we'll see the most pushback, because I think that they're just at like base level so many good critiques of Deleuze and Guattari from the lens of like settler colonialism, from the lens of anti-blackness, from the lens of also even other kind of like interpretations of capitalism and Marxism and stuff like that. And so I definitely think that there is a lot of time that needs to be put into how you're really answering these arguments individually in order to make the app really responsive and kind of like thorough in the way that it's kind of like hedging back against a lot of these criticisms, which I definitely think is possible and definitely could put you in an advantageous position if you're kind of going beyond the kind of like basic normative debates that people are really having about Deleuze and Guattari versus some of these other arguments, and really finding like niche ways to push other teams into being able to contest like the examples and the historical kind of like nature of the argument that you're making. I think that there's a lot of stuff that you can really do creatively here that I think is super important. So first, I think that on the criticism, which you should really be trying to look at do at a top priority, is trying to figure out the way in which you want to frame the question of like what should our response to the resolution be in against a lot of teams. I feel like a lot of teams will have like really good links to just like base level arguments about like what Deleuze kind of like theorizes, the way that Deleuze is thinking about desire, the way that Deleuze kind of like invests in just like Western means of like thinking about desire and thinking about like how we should relate to kind of humanity as a whole. But I feel like a lot of the arguments that people normatively make about like stuff that kind of follows Deleuze's canon in a debate sense are usually more like anti-humanist kind of like ways of thinking about like how we should theorize resistance and how we should theorize like our relationship to violence. And so I think that in order for you to kind of like hedge a lot of this stuff against the other team and get closer to what I think is probably the better strategy, which is like a link turn permutation strategy, is by just kind of like being able to win that regardless of whether or not you're able to agree on like the top level kind of like structural condition for like how the world is created. That's not really where Deleuze and Guattari are kind of like sticking and hedging themselves. It's really a question of like what our response to the condition of like the status quo should be. And I feel like if you're reading arguments close to what we were talking about before in terms of things like destituent power and arguments about like the pink war machine or just war machines in general, then you have a long history to take from in terms of like why the types of patterns of resistance that you're thinking of are helpful and along the same kind of axes of how the criticism would respond to the resolution. And I feel like the way in which you then are able to use that in term to like hedge the status quo and then against the link arguments makes it a lot harder for the other team to be able to win really any other alternative besides refusal. I feel like in the world of a refusal alternative, a lot of the arguments you then want to make is like what happens in a world where the state does recognize the workers' strike or attempts to like consume resistance in other ways, which is done historically. What does refusal do to like ready our response or to make other forms of resistance possible? And I feel like just overloading them with having to defend like some type of like solvency from the alternative level gets you a lot closer to either just winning that the app outweighs, or being able to win that the consideration of the affirmative should come like prior to like whether or not you're able to win like every facet of the permutation proper. And if whether it's really just a question of whether or not the advantages of doing the affirmative along like a similar axis as the alternative is just like worth the judge kind of like taking a risk on, which I think is a lot easier way to frame a lot of your responses to the criticisms, and a much easier way to like create nuanced sets of responses that all kind of accomplish the same thing, but that pull from different histories and are really specific to the debates that you're having. And it allows you to really build strong 2AC, 1AR, 2AR modules that are like easy to kind of carry throughout the debate. I then think that when you kind of like move into what this kind of looks like as a counterplan or as a dissad question, I think a lot of the responses that you'll really want to think about for, I think a lot of the questions that you'll really want to consider for the counterplan dissad debate is what are the ways in which you can win that like the recognition of the worker strike doesn't outweigh the various other ways in which like the consumption of other resistance movements creates and like informs violence. I feel like there are so many good arguments to say historically about how the state, not only like the US, but like if we're just talking about, you know, a just government, whatever, like what how global paradigms of governance have basically allowed the kind of coerciveness of like scoping resistance into institutions in order to create very like militarized responses to those that are still strive for resistance outside of the state. And I feel like a lot of your arguments, especially in the context of Deleuze, are really able to like win why there's an inevitable stake of violence, no matter what their kind of like impact is at like a climate level or like an IR level or like at a democracy modeling level or anything like that. I feel like all kind of like lead back to the same question, which is like, how does that not reinvoke the same type of managerialism that you're kind of like indicting for like how governance is able to continue itself if they're right about the linkages between the worker strike and all of these other kind of like impacts. And there are so many good arguments to make about like why there's that kind of like proves why the very like process of being able to consume the worker strike is what makes like the very coercion of like the state as an institution or the sovereignness just in certain institutions so powerful and easy to be done, and why that performative gesture still requires an investment in particular forms of violence that make it a lot harder to think about like what resistance can look like in other ways and how that resistance holds the state like even more accountable, or why it at least creates the basis for other forms of mutual insurvivability outside of what the government or the sovereign at a capacity can really offer. And I think that being able to bring that vantage point in brings a lot of like better offense for you to kind of develop much easier impact comparison debates and much better indites of like whatever type of like counterplan they could be using to kind of solve back for some of the arguments that you're directly making about why the state is kind of like, or like the state as a structure is kind of like doomed to fail in such a way. But yeah, hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully these conversations on Deleuze and Guattari have been helpful. If this is the end of the series, then I'm definitely glad that I had a good time explaining this stuff to you all, and that you all hopefully enjoyed it and it was useful. But yeah, thank you so much.